Welcome to episode 59 of the Energy Balance Podcast, where we teach you how to live without constant hunger and cravings, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, and other low energy symptoms by maximizing your cellular energy. I'm Jay Feldman. I'm a health coach and independent health researcher. And joining me again today is my good friend, Mike Fave. Mike and I have been studying health and nutrition together for a long time now, and Mike also draws on his experiences from working within the healthcare industry. Today's episode is part 4 of our series discussing tissue oxygenation, cellular swelling, pH balance, and other related topics. In the first few episodes of this series, we discussed carbon dioxide, lactate, glycolysis, and pH balance and their relationship with our metabolism. And then in the last episode, we discussed many situations where you see these symptoms and issues play out, such as in altitude sickness, panic attacks and anxiety, swelling and edema, heart failure, and other related health states. And then in today's episode, we'll be talking about how you can increase carbon dioxide and minimize lactate in order to rectify these issues and support your metabolism and improve your health. So this is a pretty physiology-heavy series, and so if that's not your cup of tea, you might want to go back and listen through episodes 1 through 7 of the podcast, where we took some time to build a foundation as far as the bioenergetic view of health is concerned. Although in today's episode, it will not be quite as heavy on the physiology, as we'll be talking about a lot of the applications here and what we can actually do to improve our health situation regarding these factors. So in specific today, we'll be talking about the major problem with Wim Hoff breathing and an alternative breathing method that supports carbon dioxide production. We'll be talking about why using thyroid, caffeine, and other metabolic stimulants can either increase or decrease carbon dioxide production depending on the context. We'll be talking about why burning carbohydrates leads to more than a 50% increase in carbon dioxide production relative to fat burning. We'll be talking about how PUFA consumption decreases carbon dioxide production, and we'll be talking about the best carbohydrate sources that will oppose stress and support carbon dioxide production. To check out the show notes for today's episode, head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at the studies and articles and any other relevant links or anything else that we reference throughout today's episode. And if you are struggling with any of these symptoms or conditions that we've been discussing throughout this series, whether that's high blood pressure and edema, or if you have experiences with altitude sickness or heart failure, or another one that we hadn't mentioned was migraines and headaches, which can also be related to this set of symptoms that we described, or this set of factors that affect our metabolism. Or if you're dealing with any other low energy symptoms, whether that's chronic cravings and hunger, fatigue or low energy, chronic pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms like bloating or inflammation, brain fog, poor sleep or insomnia, or any hormonal imbalances, low libido, or any other low energy symptoms or chronic health conditions, then head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for a free energy balance mini course, where I'll explain how these different symptoms and conditions are really caused by a lack of energy. And I'll also explain the main things that you can do from a diet and lifestyle perspective to improve your cellular energy, to maximize your cellular energy and optimize your health and reverse these symptoms and conditions. So to sign up for that free energy balance mini course, head over to jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy. And with that, let's pick up where we left off at the end of the last episode, where Mike was discussing the importance of energy and the structuring of water as primary drivers of our health.
So the key point here is to make sure that your cell energy is working. You're streaming energy through the cell. In order to create that structure, in order to create structure in general, you need to have cellular energy being produced. And this is where you get, I'm going to name drop Pete again, but his hypothesis is essentially, energy and structure are interdependent at every level. And because it's essentially, the reaction is like a feed forward, like a spiraling up reaction, where it's like the more energy produced your cells can produce, the more structure you can have. The more structure you have, the more you're able to produce energy. So it's like cyclically going forward. It's like a never-ending process, right? It continues upon itself based on whatever the resources there are in the environment. But when that stops working, when you don't have the energy, then the structure starts to degrade. And then when the structure starts to degrade, you can produce less energy. And then when you produce less energy, more structure degrades. So you can either technically be going in either one direction. You're either producing energy and therefore structure, or you're not you're losing production of energy, and then you're losing structure. And through this lens, you can get a sense of aging, right? So aging, it would essentially be, as opposed to the idea that you're burning the candle too hot and you're going to melt all the wax and be done, or you're running through the machine. In biological life, at least from this perspective, the idea is that you want to be producing more energy, because then you'll be maintaining and producing more structure. Or if you start lowering energy metabolism with all this, whatever this, I don't know, caloric restriction and metformin and sirtuins and whatever else, then you lowering energy production, and then you're starting to basically, over time, you're just slowly degrading structure. The reason these things don't, I think, wipe things out right away is because the biological systems have multiple checks and balances built around making sure that you can still produce energy even in suboptimal conditions. Because if you don't, it's essentially death. Like when you don't have that energy streaming through, then you just have basically a puddle of solutes and proteins. What brings the solutes, and the solutes being the ions and the proteins, to life is the energy streaming through them and producing the structure with water. Without that, it's like if you took me and you put me in a bucket, I could just be a whole bunch of sodium, potassium, carbon, and whatever else. But when you add energy to that system, then it starts to arrange and you start to get life and life forms and whatever else.
Yeah. And those analogies that you were talking about, like the candle burning or the machine, the reason why those are so problematic is because a better way to look at it would be a situation where burning the candle faster actually increases the size of the candle. Like it builds the candle, which is obviously like not something that would actually happen. It just doesn't make sense. But that's why that's such a problem.
Yeah.
That's
why the analogy is the problem. It's the wrong analogy.
Yeah. Same thing with the machine.
The
car, machine, whatever. Like the more you run it, once it hits 100,000 miles, if it's a car, or 200,000 or whatever, it starts to break down, and you have to replace parts. But that's not how our bodies work. Our bodies replace their own parts. They're like transformers. They just need an energy source, and they can keep building. So,
well, that's the beauty, right? It's like with a car, you have to actually get the whole part and put it together. With a human, you can take other parts that aren't necessarily like the holistic piece. Like, if you break your arm, you don't need to like put a new arm on a human. If we break our arm, or an animal in general, you just need to make sure that there's enough energy available, and then there's enough resources available, and the body will take those components, break them down into their basic units, and then rebuild them using the energy where they need to go. It's like that system is way more complex than an Audi. Like your Audi may be able to tell you if a car is coming on the left or the right, and it may be able to help you park, but it doesn't take components. It doesn't take components, break them down into basic blocks, and then use some for energy, and then intelligently replace those other pieces where they need to go. Like that's the beauty and the intelligence of the living system versus these non-living systems that we have. That's what the other thing is. Like it does these things autonomously. It doesn't need to be programmed like you don't need to take a new program and put it in to do it. You just need to put the pieces in there, and it just does it. It's kind of amazing, and it does it with all different types of tissues and all different areas of the body. It's like, how does it prioritize going to that arm that's broken versus somewhere else? It just knows, and the systems have been built and developed around it. So it's kind of crazy when you actually think about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing that you touched on, like a broken arm or any sort of injury, ideally should heal perfectly if energy is good and the organism is perfectly healthy. And that's why Ray Peat talks about that being able to happen in the fetus, for example. Like it's in an absolute perfect environment, high CO2, high glucose. There's no like stress or injury on it, assuming everything's fine. And that's why it can basically heal injury without a scar. But once we're in the real world with all of the insults that we have in our modern environment, when we get an injury, it doesn't tend to heal perfectly. It heals pretty well. But then the older and older you get, the more basically scarring you get. And that's kind of the aging process. Is basically aging is like a sign of or basically all it is an inability to properly heal and repair in response to stress, to the point where the machine does get kind of degraded. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that that's what it's stuck with. It's something you can reverse the other way,
To some
assuming,
degree. Yeah.
well, I mean, there should be no limit to it. The only limit is what's around us, right? So you just have to go up to altitude and not have any stress and have the absolute perfect diet and not be exposed to any, non-native EMFs and no chemicals and no, like harmful chemicals and pesticides and things. And you have to,
Well, that's my point.
right, and just have to live a couple 100,000 years ago where CO2 is even higher. What other things? Perfect, like, amount of sunlight, no previous stress in all the generations leading up to you. So
Yeah, I mean, there's a degree. The thing is I think there's kind of a important like spectrum here. It's like at certain levels of degradation, right? Like it's going to be hard to recover from some of that. Like, but the one thing is they are showing by adjusting certain things they can actually make that happen. Like there's some interesting research playing with morphogenic fields and like using progesterone as a bioreactor and high CO2 concentrations to regenerate limbs in animals that like they're not salamanders, right? This is like bunny rabbits and things like that normally could not regenerate those limbs. And so what they're showing is essentially by manipulating the environment in the correct way, you can actually create like massive amounts of regeneration. Now they're not doing that on humans yet, but the point being is that if we can manipulate our environment with the resources that we have now, and the limiting aspect is what are the resources that we currently have now. That's kind of the limiter, right?
Mhm.
It's not like you can crawl back in your mom's womb and be like, all right, heal me. It's more like you got to use with what you got in our current environment. And that's what it really comes to, is that, and that's what everything that we talk about and the strategy that we talk about is what can we use in our current environment, at least that you and I know of, to basically heal, to optimize these energetic processes and provide the resources that they need and the amounts that they need and the ratios that they need, et cetera. And and when we work with people, that's what we're doing. We're basically
Mhm.
fixing those processes. And for some people, it's geared around different situations. Some people have a gut issue. Other people are dealing with high blood pressure. A lot of times they all go hand in hand. But you just have to, like, the nuances is where you're going to focus first and how much energy you're going to put into each place, which buttons are you going to push and how hard are you going to push them. I mean, that's what it comes to. But the whole point here is, and what we're going to get to, what we've been trying to get to, and like with all our strategies, is essentially fixing the energy metabolism the best we can with what we have. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, a lot of Ray's recommendations, or Georgie, or whoever else is coming to this perspective, and even the researchers who talk about these things, like this is essentially what they're getting at.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I was obviously being semi-facetious with some of the things I was
Yeah.
saying, but the idea is legitimate, which is that the more that we improve our environment to support energy production and increase our energy availability, the more we'll move towards regeneration, and the more we'll slow aging, and the more we'll recover from stress and injury better. And as you're saying, that's what we're trying to do with people who aren't, have gotten to a point where they're experiencing various symptoms and issues because they haven't been in an environment like that. And so we're adjusting our environment in whatever way we can to best support that. So obviously there are certain limitations that we experience in the real world, but there's still a lot that we can do to support that energy availability. So that's what we're moving toward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And were you going to say something?
Before you move on, I want to add one piece, but
Okay.
I just wanted to point out here, when you mentioned that Ray talks about the importance of, or like the ability of the fetus to completely heal injuries in utero, in the womb. What I want to point out here that like is a very, I think, important point in the context of energy and structure are interdependent at every level, is that making sure that the mother and the father take care of themselves prior to pregnancy and have the necessary building blocks to produce a healthy baby, and that the mother has like a relatively stress-free and well-supported or like optimal environment for her pregnancy, allows for her and the baby to have increased energy available to increase structure. So uh, optimizing that environment for the mother during pregnancy gives, essentially the way I see it is, gives that baby increased reserves for life, because they develop more structure. And then when the baby comes out, eliminating stresses and making sure that the baby has a solid environment while they're growing so that they can have optimal amounts of energy allows that baby's body, and when they're a child, whatever else, as they go through puberty, to create optimal structure because they have the amount of energy they need. So these are all critical periods for the baby, for this developing human. And it's extremely important that these critical periods are from like puberty, or like the whole growth phase, all the way back down to like conception and prior to conception. The parents' health are important to optimize if you want to like optimize society and everything going forward, is to make these the best periods possible, not derange them with some of the things that we do now with formula feeding and all that other bullshit that is going on. And it's when you start thinking about things in these terms, like some of these things are just kind of like disgusting that it's going on that way, or like causing like massive amounts of immune response when the baby's really young, and that like in creating inflammatory reactions. Like those aren't good things. Like, and I'm just going to leave it there, but I wanted to point that out, that those periods, like where the baby's creating their structure, like that sets the tone for the rest of their lives and sets their capabilities. And I think like there's a lot of like IQ and race and all this stuff and whatever else, but I think what's, and like even like the idea of genetics and nature versus nurture, but what I think it really comes down to, and this is where all the epigenetics comes from, is like optimizing the environment, optimize the individuals, and it's a continual process from individual to the baby and the children that individual create, and then their children and then their children. It's like all of this is an accumulation of the environments that they were able to create for themselves and the amount of energy and structure they were able to build over time. And so it can either feed forward, it can be going in a great direction, a positive direction, or it can be going in a negative direction and degrading over time. And it's just kind of like, which way do you want it to go?
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were getting at too, I mean, these things get passed down in a way that really affects the whole evolutionary path of a species, where the amount of energy available can dictate whether increased complexity is a possibility for that species, and whether they're going to, they're going to drive towards increased complexity or reduced complexity, and whether they're going to increase their brain size and be able to, and you kind of see that throughout all the different species and when they might have split and what could have been going on in the environment to allow for that.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll have to have that, that conversation on
that.
yeah, on evolution and genetics and in the epigenetics and all of that in the future. But yeah, the environment and energy availability is what drives that. And that's when you also get people talking about potentially previous civilizations or previous subspecies or other like human type species potentially being more intelligent or potentially living for much longer, and possibly being, having lived up in the mountains or having been in a particular time in history when there was much more CO2 circulating in the atmosphere. So yeah, just interesting things to think about that we'll dive in more in the future, but definitely helpful to keep all of those things in context as far as the way that they affect our health and the generations beyond us. And aging, and it's all very intertwined conversation. But circling back, there's a couple other things I wanted to touch on, just situations where you see the same hypoxia and lack of CO2 and basically respiratory alkalosis. And you had talked about diabetes and the edema seen there. And that's also responsible, at least in part, for the neuropathy seen in that state in diabetes, which is basically like nerve damage due to compression, which can happen due to swelling in the area. So that's just another situation there that's worth mentioning.
And energetic failure with the cells at that nerve area.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it goes directly to that as well. It's like the whole system is deranged.
Yeah. And then the other thing too, and I know I mentioned this earlier, is all those situations where cetazolamide is used, like various forms of edema, glaucoma, epilepsy, altitude sickness, heart failure. And again, the cetazolamide is working by increasing CO2. So that's basically showing the involvement of this whole situation, this whole pathway in that, in these different states, and how much increasing CO2 can help with that.
Yeah.
So as far as increasing carbon dioxide goes, you already talked about this before. I mean, you talked about like the most important piece here, which is, and we talked about this the whole time, is just increasing mitochondrial respiration, increasing the amount of energy we're producing, and increasing the amount of CO2 we're producing. And complete glucose oxidation is going to be the best way to do that. And that's because, as we mentioned earlier, when comparing glucose to fat oxidation, you produce less CO2 with fat oxidation, 50% less. And that's because the pyruvate to acetyl CoA conversion but that basically connects glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, increases carbon dioxide production. And that's why when you convert the pyruvate to lactate, you miss out on that as well. And that's why you can, so that's a huge part of why we want to be encouraging glucose oxidation, especially in the places that need it, in the areas that need to be respiring at a high level and producing a lot of energy. And then the other factor as well between comparing glucose and fat oxidation has to do with the NAD to NADH ratio, which allows glucose oxidation to run faster and produce more ATP and more CO2 in the same amount of time. And so that also helps to increase carbon dioxide production and oxygenation. So overall, big picture, the best way to support your metabolism, do all the things that we said that are on the beneficial side, and push everything in that feed forward reaction, is to increase glucose oxidation. And then, as you mentioned as well, there are certain things that can block that process. And that's always the place we want to address first, because you don't want to try to stimulate that process and increase it with something like caffeine or thyroid if there are certain things blocking it. So you mentioned endotoxin as being one of those main things that blocks it, which is definitely the case. And other gut toxins can have the same effect. So that's one thing to consider, is improving gut health and reducing endotoxin production. We've had several episodes talking about gut health, so I'll link back to those. Nutrient deficiencies can prevent efficient glucose oxidation. So addressing those will be particularly helpful, and we'll talk about that in detail. But the B vitamins and magnesium are going to be incredibly important there. But really any nutrient deficiency, I mean, copper as well, or zinc, really anything is going to, all of the vitamins and minerals have a role in glucose oxidation, in mitochondrial respiration. And so if we're low on any of them, that's gonna be a bottleneck. Yeah. And then some other things that can inhibit that process. I mean, excess stress emotionally or physiologically, that's driving the increase in stress hormones, is going to block that process. And that could be overexercising. That could be just living in a stressful life. It could be not getting enough sleep. Those things are all going to drive you towards that lactate producing state. And others, I know I mentioned nutrient deficiencies, having excessive amounts of certain nutrients, like excess iron can be an issue there. Any sort of heavy metal can be an issue there and can
PUFA.
kind of disrupt these processes. And yeah, PUFA, definitely. So polyunsaturated fats are really good at inhibiting the efficiency of mitochondrial respiration and basically inhibiting the effectiveness of the electron transport chain, which is then going to cause all those problems we talked about before. And so decreasing PUFA consumption is huge in that regard.
They do it by impairing structure, by being incorporated into the mitochondria and being more easily damaged, the mitochondrial membrane, and being more easily damaged and whatnot. So they're just generally not ideal.
Yeah, becoming more easily damaged, which causes all those issues. And then also basically being more permeable, kind of like how we talked about a cell that's lacking energy is more permeable to sodium and sodium and calcium coming in, and that causes it to swell and everything. Basically, the same thing happens in the mitochondria when you have a lot of PUFA, where we talked about like the proton gradient being important for producing energy at the electron transport chain, and the PUFA causes basically a leakage there, so you don't have as much of that gradient, which is like if you think of it as like a hydroelectric generator or something, where you need the pressure of the water on one side to drive it, you're like decreasing that pressure. I don't remember what analogy we had before, but I don't know. It's like, I don't know. We had some analogy talking about the gradient before. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, because AT pace is like the hydroelectric dam, like with the protons going through. Mm-hmm. And so it's like if the dam is leaky, then the water's leaking out like from the cracks, then it's not able to run across the turbine and basically create energy. And PUFA is essentially putting cracks in the system. Yeah. And it's like, there's, whether or not you believe in a requirement for PUFA, like the requirement is so low and it's like completely unavoidable in the diet that you'd be hard pressed to miss the requirement if you were eating like a generally healthy whole foods diet, at least with the principles that we've previously described. So it's like the idea is still to keep it as low as you can on a normal diet. None of those, no lab diets, right? No sucrose and cornstarch and whatever else diets that they give these rats to induce the deficiencies, right? Like super hydrogenated coconut oil, whatever else.
Yeah. Not that that's the problem. I mean, definitely anyway. Yeah.
No, it's not that those are the problems. It's just like extremely, extremely like refined things that you couldn't nutrientless, whatever else. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing with the PUFA too, talking about this mineral balance, is that in addition to leaking, causing a leaking of that proton gradient, they've been shown to cause that same leaking of the sodium into the cell. And we would say that that's due to the lack of energy. But they say that basically it's the same thing where it's kind of the cell becomes permeable to the sodium,
more fluid.
Right. And then they say that increases the energy demand because it has to increase the pumping of the sodium potassium ATP pump, which basically is saying that it requires energy to force the sodium out. So it's just another area that PUFA, even when it's not damaged and oxidized and destroying your DNA and protein structure and all of that, it's still having these effects by increasing the permeability, basically in the parallel way that a lack of energy does. And then it also happens to decrease the energy production too. So it also directly causes the lack of energy. So it's a huge one when it comes to wanting to, if you want to keep CO2 high and produce a lot of energy, you don't want to have a lot of PUFA.
Yeah. And that also doesn't if you take that in context of like a structured water point of view as the main determinant of cell structure rather than a membrane, anything that's making it more fluid isn't necessarily good. Like you want to be maintaining the gel state. So if like PUFA is making it more fluid, then that's increasing the influx of sodium and then also impairing energy metabolism. Like those are basically 3 nails in the coffin right there for having a high amounts of PUFA in the diet and like it being super beneficial or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so then some other things when it comes to improving carbon dioxide production, obviously, as we said, like getting enough carbohydrates is going to be important, having them spaced out so you're keeping the stress hormones down. There are, and then when you have removed some of those blocks that we've talked about, whether it's PUFA or, a lack of various nutrients or endotoxin, and then doing things to help kind of stimulate that process can help increase the production of carbon dioxide. So that would be using something like thyroid or caffeine. B vitamins are another one that help to drive this process. And as we talked about before, B1 is vital in increasing the conversion from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA through pyruvate dehydrogenase. And that's that step that connects glycolysis to the Krebs cycle. And basically that is the main regulation step, determining whether the glucose is getting turned into lactate or if it's going to be moving on. Obviously, things still have to function right at the electron transport chain, but that's kind of that switch right there. So that's extremely important. So having enough B1 is important there,
which is thiamine.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. But virtually all of the B vitamins have roles in various aspects of energy production. So getting enough of those or having extra amounts of those can help drive it a little further and increase carbon dioxide production.
Yep. And each one of those, what you can actually take pretty large amounts of B1 without causing necessarily deficiencies of the other B vitamins and like it's being relatively safe. But with B vitamins in general, you have to think like if I'm going to push the gas pedal and basically connect glycolysis to cell respiration, then I'm probably going to need more NAD plus to carry electrons, which means you're going to need more B3. Yeah, and you're probably going to need more riboflavin for FAD. So what it really comes down to is you can't just take, if you're going to use B vitamins, you're probably going to want to use like the whole consortium of B vitamins rather than just one. And that's why they usually have B complexes. But just something to keep in mind with anybody thinking about experimenting with taking this B vitamin or that B vitamin. And even though we're talking about B1 specifically here, or even B3 for energy production, they're important. They require the other vitamins, and some like taking B3 can cause issues with the methylating B vitamins and whatnot. So just something to keep in mind as far as applicable information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then a couple of things that are more specific to increasing carbon dioxide production. One is kind of parallel to the bag breathing that we talked about. And, if someone's hyperventilating, if they're having a panic attack, bag breathing can help to increase the amount of carbon dioxide you're inspiring, just kind of like, what all those studies looking at increasing carbon dioxide in the air that you're breathing. So that can be helpful. But in general, there's a breathing practice called Buteyko, which can also be really helpful here, basically by training yourself to breathe in less and breathe out less, so that you're breathing off less carbon dioxide in general. And that can be helpful for also raising carbon dioxide levels, kind of in a parallel way to altitude, where it's kind of the equivalent of not breathing in as much oxygen, and in a parallel way to bag breathing, or just in a parallel way to having really effective oxygenation. And it can help increase that by increasing the carbon dioxide availability. And some of the things they talk about in Buteyko breathing is that you tend to see hyperventilation, not only in like a panic disorder stress state, but also we were talking about symptoms of somebody's aging. Generally, if you see someone who's really not doing well, they're old in their age, they have trouble breathing, like they have to breathe a lot, it's heavy, they can't breathe through their nose. And that tends to be a sign that they're not respiring well and they're not getting enough carbon dioxide. And so Buteyko breathing is kind of built on the opposite idea there, which is also important to mention, is the opposite of a lot of breathing techniques. Or a lot of breathing techniques, whether it's like Wim Hoff or
Wim Hoff.
Yeah, you're doing the exact opposite. You're basically forcing, like, it's very stressful. You're increasing adrenaline and stress hormones, which again can always feel good in the short term, but you're doing that by decreasing carbon dioxide and causing that whole HPA activation, that whole stress activation that we talked about earlier that happens in those quotes from those studies. And so that's what you're doing with something like Wim Hof, and the opposite. Buteyko is kind of like the opposite of that.
They actually prove that. There's studies on Wim Hof's breathing. And basically, like, they injected the volunteers with endotoxin after they had them do Wim Hof's breathing, or like they had them do Wim Hof's breathing and then injected them with endotoxin, or injected them with endotoxin, like not a dose to obviously hurt them, but like a dose to stimulate an immune response. And this was like human volunteers, and then had them do Wim Hof's breathing, and they didn't necessarily respond to the endotoxin. So we were like, oh, that's great. And it's like, the reason they didn't respond necessarily to the endotoxin is because after they did Wim Hof's breathing, the adrenaline levels in their blood were ridiculously high. And so essentially my thought process behind this, and this is something that we talked about, is like the adrenaline, basically they just started seriously raising, I would guess, fatty acids in the blood and through adrenaline's mechanism. And then the fatty acids basically help to mitigate the response to endotoxin, and then maybe even the adrenaline itself helped. But in the study, they basically showed that like breathing like that, like blowing off all your CO2, like strongly elevated adrenaline, which is kind of antithetical to what we want to do here.
It's hormetic.
Yeah. But the thing is, adrenaline has a whole host of, especially in like chronically being raised, negative effects on energy metabolism and shifting towards like fatty acid metabolism and things along those lines. So It's not necessarily like, it's not ideal. It's not ideal to be doing things in that way per se. And this is why I laugh when I see it, especially when you, like, if you're a clinician and you look at things like Kussmaul breathing, which is where you're basically trying to blow off CO2 in like really pathologic states. Or if you understand what we're talking about with the Bohr and the Haldane effect, like going out and actively do as a meditation technique, blowing off all your CO2 definitely is not a good idea.
Yeah. And another explanation, maybe the increases in free fatty acids is protective there too, but also adrenaline is there for backup energy production. Like there's a reason why it increases when you're doing intense exercise, and there's value there. It helps you deal with whatever the demand is at the moment.
Short term.
Yeah, it just comes at a cost. You're accruing debt in that way. And so that's why increasing adrenaline can help you deal with anything. Normally your body is making that evaluation. It's experiencing the endotoxin, and it's kind of like, I'd rather deal with a little bit of inflammation now rather than accruing all this debt with adrenaline, and I'll just kind of deal with it. And instead you're saying, no, let's accrue the debt. Let's take out a loan with this adrenaline, so that way we don't feel the effects of endotoxin. Like, it's not a net benefit. It's just a benefit in the short term at the cost of a long term. And another example of that is an EpiPen. Like, that's why an EpiPen is used when someone's having an extreme allergic reaction. It alleviates the reaction by driving immediate energy production, which is great. And obviously it's better than dying. And that's kind of what we talked about this whole time. Like, these acute adaptive responses are much better than dying, but they're just coming at a cost. And so I wouldn't, you don't want to use an EpiPen all the time to like feel good during the day or to like get enough energy when you wake up in the morning, which I'm saying is the equivalent of Wim Hof breathing. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, our body is adapted to are adapted to have short bursts of these situations, right? Working out, if you had a fight, or if you had to run from something, whatever it was. But chronically hammering these pathways is definitely not a good idea. And like even in ICUs, like long-term use of some of the adrenergic agents are not necessarily good, or like the vasopressing agents, whatever they are. And then the other thing is, if you see like the other stress hormones from the adrenal gland, your glucocorticoids like cortisol and whatnot, when you see like synthetic use of them, like prednisone, prednisolone, dexamethasone, whatever it is, the long-term effects and the side effect profiles of all these are essentially the same as chronic diseases, right? It's like high cholesterol, high blood sugar, thinning skin, wrinkles, stretch marks, abdominal obesity. Like, and those are the extreme examples of what these hormones do, either in uh with super physiological effects, because a lot of the synthetic glucocorticoids have groups added to them to make them way more potent and like less metabolizable, which is, I mean, it's helpful for lowering inflammation acutely. But again, for acute situations, they can be life saving. But in long term situations, or like chronic exposure, is absolutely terrible for the physiology. It completely degrades it, and that's what you see with long term use of these drugs in cancer, or in any type of autoimmune disease, or in certain like acute events like strokes or brain tumors or whatever it is. And people that go on these like a long time, you can see, like I've seen patients in the hospital, they have cancer, they get their diagnosis, they do whatever surgery, whatever they're going to do, and then they put them on the steroids, and then they blow up. Their blood sugar goes insane. Like especially if you're diabetics, don't give a diabetic a steroid. They're
They already have a steroid. They're
exactly.
already they're already really high in glucocorticoids. Yeah,
exactly. And then it's like you'll see blood sugars like skyrocket on people who weren't diabetic can start getting high blood sugars. They'll start getting high blood lipids, high cholesterol. They literally will make them fat. Like in a matter of like a month, you start seeing like abdominal obesity, loss of muscle mass. Some women get like stretch marks. You start to see wrinkles, like the face gets fat, like just all the consequences of disease, like that degradation of structure and from the loss of energy production with these hormones, is just, it's really not good. So yeah, these adaptive processes are there for the short term to help us drive increased resources and energy production when we need it. But long term, they come at that cost, that debt. And that debt is the structure of your body.
Yeah. And that those the cortisol and glucocorticoids and cortisone, like the medications, work in the same way as the adrenaline, as we were talking about, where it helps decrease the inflammation immediately. It helps, you use it on like a skin rash or whatever people use it for if they're inflamed. But as you're saying, in the long term, it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
And I wanted to clarify also that acute, I know you said like we're developed to acutely deal with situations through the stress hormones, like running from a tiger or, exercise or things.
It's always the tiger.
Yeah. And it's true, we are adapted to it. It doesn't mean it doesn't come at a cost. Like spending a lot of your time running from a tiger is not going to lead to a healthy organism.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, like when we're exercising, there is that stress there, and there's benefits to exercise that outweigh that stress. And this comes back to that whole hormesis argument. So there's still benefits to those things, but that's why doing it too much it comes at a cost. So we just want to be aware that we don't want to be driving that stress, and we definitely don't want to be doing it all the time with something like Wim Hof breathing. Instead, we want to be doing the opposite with something like Buteyko breathing, where again, the main idea here is that you're reducing your breathing, you're breathing gently through your nose. And because of that, it's the opposite of hyperventilation. It's hypoventilation. And it basically is mimicking the same effect as altitude. So the goal would be to kind of be in a state where you're basically doing that. So that way, I mean, it's just a good way to, keep your CO2 up. At the same time, it should be something that kind of happens naturally if you're producing a lot of CO2, and effectively oxygenating and everything. But it's just something that can help externally. And in addition to saying that it mimics the effects of altitude, another thing that increases CO2 if you adapt well is altitude. Obviously, that's just a little bit prohibitive because a lot of people can't up and move. But if you were to be able to, that would help increase CO2 as well.
Yeah. Instead of like, if you're going to get exposed to endotoxin, right? Instead of doing Wim Hof breathing, and this goes directly with what we're talking about, you can just have a glass of juice. because
Right.
the glass
Yeah.
of juice will supply you with the nutrients to help deal with that stressor. Or if you're stressed out, like you can bag breathe and you can also have some juice. And basically that sugar and the minerals that come with it and all the plant compounds can help drive energy metabolism to produce CO2. And so
Mhm.
one of the basic anti-stress measures that you can have is making sure that you're eating enough carbohydrate every day and you have enough micronutrients to be able to oxidize that carbohydrate. And enough is, that doesn't mean that you need to eat 1,000 grams of sugar a day. Enough is the amount that you need to for whatever your functioning is, right?
Yeah, to minimize stress.
Yeah, exactly, to minimize stress. And there's some studies on it. You can look at different studies, but um essentially, yeah, that's like a very key anti-stress measure, as well as eating enough protein, eating enough fats, and then eating enough micronutrients. That's your B vitamin, and we already covered that. But yeah, another basic way to increase CO2 is to be eating enough sugar and oxidizing it through cell respiration. And it's not just taking teaspoons of sugar, because we both tried that. It's more getting adequate carbs from whole fruits, fruit juices, frozen fruits, tubers that you digest well, if you digest starch as well, anything along those lines. That's really where you want to be getting your carbs from. And those are direct anti-stress measures. And there's studies basically showing this, that in the higher carbohydrate diets, you can see lower, especially in relation to protein, you can see lower cortisol levels and you can see higher androgens and things like that. And you also, low carb diets are like a key, how do I want to put this? Like, have been shown specifically to lower thyroid hormone function and to
Mhm.
raise cholesterol, which are both signs of their effect on cell energy metabolism. Because that when that high cholesterol is a sign, especially in low carb diets, that thyroid hormone is lowered, and then that cell metabolism or cell respiration and glucose oxidation isn't being isn't being prioritized and used effectively to take that cholesterol and the thyroid hormone and turn it into your steroid hormones. And then you also see a lot of low carbers come back with low sex hormones
Mhm.
like testosterone. And so um those are like key indicators of, or examples to look at the benefits of carbohydrates. And again, it's the ones that I necessarily listed. There's problems with certain carbohydrate groups like the grain-based carbohydrates and super refined carbohydrates like granulated sugar making up the bulk of your carbs every day. And just,
Right.
it's again, that's the nuance to this stuff. It's not just
Yeah.
sugar.
Yeah. And of course, like some table sugar is fine, but as you
Yeah.
said, making up the bulk of your carbohydrates, not a good idea.
Yeah. And I tried that. Just I definitely tried that.
Yeah, and as we talked about, the vitamins are and minerals are incredibly important for producing energy. So that's definitely part of the problem. We've also talked about the gut effects potentially with the granulated sugar. I mean, most people
Yeah.
should be absorbing it without it getting fermented in the colon or in the small intestine. But especially if somebody already has a digestive issue, it can
Yeah.
cause problems, and it doesn't have the benefits of the fruit polyphenols or the polyphenols from the roots and tubers and their fibers too. So that would be just some things to consider as far as the sugar thing, but as far as sugar goes. But another thing I wanted to mention along the lines of Buteyko too was just that anytime that somebody tends toward hyperventilation, whether it's because they're exercising or they're getting stressed and they're noticing that they start to breathe through their mouth, or if they do it when they're sleeping, those are all times that you would want to try as much as you can to reduce that ventilation, reduce your breathing, and help decrease the stress. So breathing through your nose when you're exercising would be ideal. When you notice that you're hyperventilating or you're breathing through your mouth, trying to shift towards breathing through your nose would be helpful. And then when it comes to sleeping, some people will also tape their mouths, which can also help encourage you to breathe through your nose instead of through your mouth when you're asleep, which over time should help you retain more CO2 and help improve your breathing too, so that you don't have to keep doing that forever necessarily. But a lot of people find that that helps to improve their sleep, especially if they run out of glycogen and they wake up in the middle of the night. That can be because you're
A mouth
not
breather.
oxygenating well, and yeah, and you're breathing through your mouth and you're letting off CO2, and it leads to inefficient glucose usage and you're running out of your glucose fast. Kind of like if you were using metformin. So that would be a reason why you'd want to maybe try mouth taping too. I've definitely seen it provide benefits for a lot of people. They say they sleep deeper and all of that. So those would all be things to consider when it comes to increasing carbon dioxide. I did want to mention also that we're like, just to clarify, anything that can stimulate you metabolically, whether that's thyroid or caffeine or exercise or any energy demand, can help to increase carbon dioxide and oxygenation and increase energy, or it can drive lactate production and cause all these problems. It depends on that underlying state, whether you've taken those blocks away and whether you have the not only the substrate, meaning like the carbohydrate, but the other materials necessary, like the vitamins and minerals and the low stress situation to help optimize the energy production. So you just want to be aware that you don't want to always be hitting that gas pedal, especially if you're not doing well. You want to make sure that you're fixing the ability to produce energy first before doing anything like that. And that's why I think a lot of people run into issues when they use thyroid too early or prometabolic hormones too early.
Or too much,
Or too much, yeah.
Yeah. You see people come to you like taking like, they're not feeling well. So they're like taking progesterone, pregnenolone, a gram of aspirin, niacinamide, like this whole boatload of supplements. Like, whoa, did you try it? Like, let's take it easy. Like, you're not even eating 2,500 calories a day, and you're like strongly pushing the gas pedal. It's like, let's go back to the foundation. Like, let's get the diet set first, and like then we can start incorporating this toolbox of supplements and things that you can use.
All right, that's going to wrap up this series discussing tissue oxygenation, cellular swelling, pH balance, and various related topics. Although in the next episode of the podcast, we will still be discussing carbon dioxide, although in a bit of a different context, where we'll be talking about the effects on the environment and whether we should be concerned about increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And you may be surprised by some of the information that we share in that episode. So make sure to tune in for that one. And if you have enjoyed today's episode and the rest of the series, then please leave a like or comment if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening elsewhere, please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes or a review. All of those things really do a lot to help support the podcast and are very much appreciated. To check out the show notes for today's episode and take a look at the studies and articles and anything else that we referenced throughout today's episode, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast. And if you are dealing with any of the low energy symptoms that we've discussed throughout this series, whether that's related to high blood pressure and heart failure, or edema and swelling, or any other low energy symptoms, whether that's chronic cravings and hunger, low energy or fatigue, chronic pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms like bloating or inflammation, or water retention as well, or if you're dealing with brain fog, poor sleep or insomnia, hormonal imbalances of any sort, or any other low energy symptoms or chronic health conditions, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for a free energy balance mini course where I'll explain how these different symptoms and conditions are really caused by a lack of energy. And I'll also walk you through the main things that you can do from a diet and lifestyle perspective to maximize your cellular energy and resolve these symptoms and conditions. So to sign up for that free energy balance mini course, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy. And with that, I'll see you in the next episode.